this is actually one of the starting points for me. Not all that long ago, I went to my mother's house and she demanded that after 30 years I clear out the attic where I put all my stuff. And I found my 10th grade U.S. history book. And this was the frontispiece. And this was the sort of paradigmatic image of the Americas before Columbus. And this is what I was taught in Interlake High School in 1969. And when I saw it, I was quite struck by it. As I love this picture because it's quite unusual to see a picture in which absolutely everything is wrong. I mean, usually you get a few things kind of right by accident, but this one I think is pretty much 100% wrong. You know, first, as you probably know, there weren't any horses in the Americas before Columbus. There were some of these people who wore these kind of hats up here, but I don't think any of them were in, that must be the Rocky Mountains, right? I mean, I don't know what else it could be. And I have no idea. See this guy over here? Even he sort of wandered in from some sort of Wagnerian opera. I've been occasionally shown this picture of this guy to archaeologists and anthropologists, and they'll scratch. I have no idea where he's from. These are tumbleweeds, I'm pretty sure, which didn't exist in the West. They're imports from Russia, even though they're symbols of the West. They're actually weren't around until the 19th century. And then had this huge population explosion when they were introduced. They covered the West. In fact, they were such a menace that a number of the Great Plains states attempted to enact legislation banning them. And there's going to be a big fence around Nebraska and Kansas to sort of keep tumbleweeds out. And then there are so many of them, they realized that they would actually just knock over the fence. But anyway, so the point is that what I learned in my high school sort of went along with this. I basically learned three things about the first 15,000, 20,000 years of history in the Americas. And that is that the Indians walked across the Bering Straits about 12,000 years ago, which is not all that long ago as these things go. They lived for the most part in these small scattered bands, and they had so little impact on the environment that when Europeans showed up, the hemisphere was, for all intents and purposes, a wilderness. And one way to summarize the work of the last couple generations of anthropologists, archaeologists, geographers, ecologists, and people of many other disciplines, is to say that all three of these things are now thought by the great majority of researchers to be wrong. Most of them believe that Indians were here far longer than previously believed. Again, nobody really knows, but sort of typical guesstimate type numbers are 20 to 35,000 years ago. They were here in much greater numbers than previously believed. Typical sort of estimates are 40 to 60 million. I should note that those numbers keep rising, and as a personal guess, take it for what it's worth, I would think that the numbers, because they keep rising, might settle around 80 to 100 million when the dust all comes down. But that's just a guess. And they had far greater environmental impact than previously believed. And that's something that's of particular interest to me, and something I'm going to be talking about at greater length. So what I thought I would do to start off the talk proper is to show you my idea of what might be a better paradigmatic image, what really might be a good way of putting that sort of first image in a high school textbook of what Native America was like. And this is a mural that's on the wall of this fantastic archaeology museum in Mexico City by the wonderful Mexican artist Miguel Covarrubia, and it shows Tenochtitlan, the capital of what's been called the Aztec Empire, as Cortez saw it. And there is, in the basin of Mexico, which is the sort of central part of Mexico, where Mexico City is now located, there's kind of a ring of mountains and high ridges. The bottom of this basin, there is a swampy area that over a few centuries, native peoples drained to create these large, sort of S-shaped series of artificial lakes, generally called Lake Texcoco, kind of 100 miles long from one end to the other, depending how you measure it. On the western side were these low, swampy islands that, in a fashion very much like Venice, they drained, then they used the dredging to add more artificial islands. These were separated by canals. The big difference between this and Venice is that Venice was much smaller. Venice's population never got above 90 or 100,000, and the most recent estimate I've seen of Tenochtitlan's population was about 216,000. It's a much larger place. A couple of things that Covarrubias didn't know about. There's some big aqueducts that took water in from the mountains. It had a running water. It had really quite advanced sewage system. And then of course there is You can barely see it here. You didn't know about this. Do you see this little line here? This is a baffle. It's to break up the incoming spring tide, from the water that runs down into there. And it's exactly the same system that they're now building around Venice. The native peoples have figured it out a few centuries before the Italians. And another thing that Covarrubias didn't know about, I should say, is the fact that there are, of course, thousands of boats that took people and goods and services around this busy, active, thoroughly urbanized place. And also around the edge of the city were these sort of satellite cities. And there's actually arguments, I have a paper somewhere where there's an argument about whether this was the most heavily urbanized place in the world or the second most heavily urbanized place in the world. It was, an enormously citified place. And this is true of most of Native America. Most Indians were not these sort of nomadic peoples that you see in the movies, but in fact were either living in cities or large towns, or were providing food by growing agriculture for those large towns. This was a settled, heavily urbanized place, much like Europe or Asia, and I also think Africa. Now, this kind of thing was not an exception. The largest city north of the Rio Grande for quite some time was Cahokia, which is near St. Louis. Some of the largest earthen mounds anywhere in the world, they're still there. To give you some idea of how much this country how seriously we take our native heritage, this was recently upgraded from a county park to a state park. And there's a big highway that runs through the middle of the thing that wiped out a bunch of the mounds. Again, this is an artist reproduction. If you go there are people here and so forth. This is an idea of what it looked like. Estimate of its population go up to 100,000. Which was probably too large, but it gives you some idea. This is a pretty big place in 1250 AD. If you go to the Andes, there's cities all over the place. Here's a sort of a no-name ruin that I visited once, and I was stunned when the archaeologist who was excavating it informed me that the city wall in this place I'd never heard of is actually bigger than the city wall around Imperial Rome. Probably the most well-known are Teotihuacan, where there's this incredible it's about 45 minutes by bus outside of Mexico City. Any of you who are interested in urban planning can hardly help be impressed, I think, by this 11-mile long horizontal axis that defines the city, sort of their, Champs-Élysées or whatever. Estimated its population go up to 500,000 in 200 AD. It's a very big place. Again, the most important part of it, from my perspective, is that when you walk around here, everywhere up to the edge of the mountains there, it's all city. When you're walking, you can walk around for hours and you're stepping on people's houses. This is just a gigantic place. Now, one of the things that I learned as a journalist is that I'm going to decline the honor of being a historian and say that I'm a journalist so I can be irresponsible. And I discovered that if you look at maps drawn by archaeologists and maps drawn by historians, they're quite different. The archaeologists are very cautious, and so they'll show you this physical map with a couple names dropped on it. Whereas the historical map, the historian's map of, say, Europe in 1500 will, draw the boundaries around the countries as though there were real frontiers then, the way we have them today. And so I decided to be the irresponsible thing and draw an archaeological map as if I were a historian. And I began my book in this way with these sort of fake lines, the way that historians do it. So this is what was my attempt to draw the Americas at the time of Columbus, and I thought you could start here in the middle, which is about as high as I can reach. The Triple Alliance is probably a better name for the Aztec Empire than the Aztecs, which is sort of invented in the 19th century. There's these two rapidly expanding, very aggressive states there, the Tarascans, and who are sort of the Avis to the Triple Alliance's hurts. They had this heavily fortified frontier between them, kind of like North and South Korea, and then to the north, there are all these sort of consolidating political entities, the Caddo, the Calusa, then, with large groups of smaller cities. Then you get to the northeast, agriculture is only, with corn and so forth, it's only been there for a few centuries. Populations are rapidly expanding, and these loose confederations of villages are sort of bumping up and jostling against each other. Down here in the south, you have Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, probably the largest sort of centrally organized political entity anywhere on Earth. Stretches from a distance equivalent from Stockholm to Cairo, the world's largest highway system. There is a really, an amazing place, not very pleasant, run by pretty rough customers. Then all throughout here are a bunch of polities. They're not really kingdoms in the way we think of them, or chiefdoms don't really seem to apply. Nobody seems to know what to call them. Information about them is just coming out because I'm an irresponsible journalist. I drew lines around them and put them there anyway. So, but you should understand that there's just a lot of stuff going on here that we're learning about now. It's not empty. Now, when I show this, the students in particular, immediately ask me, well, there's all this stuff going on here in Columbus. What happened? Why did this all fall apart so quickly? And rather satisfyingly, you get to answer, well, 250 million years ago. And there was, as you probably vaguely recall, there was this single continent, which is called Pangaea, and continental forces break it up. And so for 200 million years, this part of the world and this part of the world have been completely separate. Evolution has done its thing, and the result is that there's completely different sets of plants and animals over here than over here. Now the reason this is important is this. There's very few, which the principal reason is by this sort of quirk of evolutionary history, there's very few domesticable animals end up in the Western Hemisphere, our part of the world. And so, whereas lots of them end up in Europe. And so Europeans, are living with animals constantly. And in fact, if you go to European houses, you'll see that, they're jammed up with a barn. Here's a Dutch painting showing people hanging out. And the reason that this is important is that most of the worst diseases that afflict humankind are what are called zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that start off as animal diseases and have a mutation in what they call jump the species barrier and become human diseases. And so smallpox, that used to be horsepox or camelpox. There's measles, that used to be bovine rinderpest. We all know about bird flu, which, in China, which is now becoming human flu. And so there's all these great killers that have gone through Europe and the Americas. Now, if you look at the same equivalent household in the Americas, in sort of a lower middle class peasant household, the terms obviously aren't the same, but you get the idea. It's sort of average household. Over here's a reconstruction one. There's no animals whatsoever. There's dead ones, but there's no living animals whatsoever except for dogs. There's none of these diseases that came through. So there is a tremendous epidemiological imbalance between this part of the world and that part of the world. And here's a partial list of the diseases that came from this part of the world and went over here. And here's a pretty complete list of the diseases that were in this part of the world and came over here.
Oh, wow.
And this is I would argue is, and I don't think I'm, saying something that's particularly right. Among people who study this is one of the most important facts in world history. A huge amount is explained by this, because all these diseases come over here, and effectively the first 150 years of European presence here is marked by the importation of these diseases. And one way to think about it is that all the countless numbers of people that were killed over the millennia by these diseases in Europe and Asia and Africa are compressed into a 150-year period over here. And some huge percentage of the native population is wiped out. And there's sort of scholarly debates about whether it's 3/4 or 90% or 95%. It doesn't really matter. There's very little that a society can do when 3/4 of its people or more are suddenly die. The consequences are just staggering. And one of the things that's worth noting is that Europeans almost never were able to, they're at the end of this huge supply chain. They couldn't really put in settlements there until the diseases, so to speak, cleared the path for them. When they arrived before the diseases, the Indians kicked them out. When they arrived after the diseases, it was no longer nearly as possible. Even so, it was tremendously difficult. But this epidemiological imbalance, which the Europeans never really understood, nor were able to control, nonetheless meant that not only did these diseases come here, but then because the local people didn't have experience with these kind of transmissible diseases, they would spread wildly. Europeans had developed quarantine And methods of dealing with infection, communicable diseases basically of that sort didn't exist here. And so these diseases, as far as we can tell, spread ahead of the Europeans. And so there's constant mentions all the way up to the 18th century of Europeans and then later Americans coming in to areas that had not been well mapped or well explored before and finding essentially cemeteries. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. It was first, surveyed and explored systematically by the Vancouver expedition in the 1780s. They arrived after a devastating smallpox epidemic that actually spread, historian Elizabeth Fenn wrote a wonderful book about how it spread from Mexico City all the way up into the West and wiped out huge portions of the population of the American West. When Vancouver arrived, there were bones littering the shores. It was a cemetery, and it's all described in the clearest possible language in not only his accounts of the voyage, but also his subordinates, like Peter Puget, the guy who Puget Sound is named after. So if there's one thing that I would sort of urge you guys to teach students is that this sets the stage. The reason that the Europeans were able to come in here at all, in my view, doesn't have anything to do with sort of superior technology or clever means of organization or being better fighters or anything. It just has to do with this absolutely extraordinary biological advantage. Now, people are still beginning to do it. With one of the projects we're doing with this book is to try and with some folks with help from National Geographic and polling experts on these various fields. And this is kind of the areas, this is all fuzzy and squishy, but these are the areas that were heavily affected by the human presence, where the land had been cleared, it was intensively burned, to give you some idea of how thoroughly marked and human-dominated the landscape of the Eastern Americas was at the time, in 1500. This is what it looked like in 1650. The red, by the way, is Europeans. This is where the land is heavily affected by Europeans. And so when, if any of your ancestors came after 1650, they saw what looked to them like a wilderness. This is where the wilderness comes from. It wasn't empty, though. It was emptied, if you follow. It was, again, after this sort of foundational story of the empty American landscape that people fled into. It was true, but it was true because the people who had inhabited it had been wiped out. Now, the thing is that these people left, it's not like they left nothing behind. What's more the case is that our ancestors didn't really have the eyes to see it, and so the impact of these people who, after all, lived in this area for thousands of years has only begun to be understood and recovered in the last couple of decades. And this is true even in places where we think of as really having no human impact at all, including the Amazon, which is something I'm going to talk about. Now, this is this sort of image of the Amazon that we generally have. This is, in fact, from a Greenpeace calendar. It's the most expensive image I've ever paid for the right to use. I really hope you guys are just drinking it in. Greenpeace soaked me. Anyway, and it does look like that. Now, one of the things, if you guys were ever to take Ecology 101, they would tell you something about the tropical forest that's kind of encapsulated in this picture, which I took, and so it cost a little less. This is the Amazon forest, in Bolivia, near the Brazilian border, and this is a cocaine processing laboratory. A few years before I took this picture, the U.S. government gave the Bolivian government some money, and they chased the bad guys away and created this inadvertent natural experiment. Here in New England, if you cleared the forest like this and then just let it sit there for 8 years, what would happen is the grass would come in, and then shrubs would come in, and there'd be trees filling in. The whole place would be green now. It wouldn't be thick forest, but it would be well on its way to recovery. As you'll notice here, in Bolivia, there's virtually nothing growing here. And the reason is, in the simplest possible terms, the rain pounds down its rainforest, and it whooshes away the nutrients. I'm sorry for such advanced scientific language. And then the sun bakes the rest into something like brick, and obviously brick isn't the best place to grow anything. And so the lesson that's been drawn, and it's in countless ecology textbooks and other things about the tropical forest, is that you can't clear the forest. You can't cut down the trees. because it ruins the soil like this and nothing grows. And if you can't cut down the trees, you can't have agriculture. If you can't have agriculture, you can't have a large society. So the lesson, the fact that this is all like this, means that the forest has really never been cut down. It's always been, you know, a virgin forest, an intact forest, a pristine forest, whatever you see. Other things you learn about the Amazon is it's full of these wonderful fruits and nuts and, you know, and useful species. And this is in fact true. This is one of my favorites. This is the ice cream bean. It's about this long, and you break it up, and it's got these seeds in it. There's one that are covered with this stuff that's kind of like wet cotton candy, and you pop it in your mouth and you suck on it. It tastes bizarrely like vanilla ice cream. I mean, sort of weirdly like vanilla ice cream. This is my son, who went on me with one of these trips, and he had overcome his aversion. That was his second or third ice cream bean of the day. Now, the other thing you learn about the people is that they're these sort of naked, gliding presences who touch the land lightly and have lived in this timeless balance of nature. The sort of standard, the Yanomami have somehow become the poster children for the tropical forest, even though they, the Amazon forest, even though they mostly live around this other river, the Orinoco. The standard book on them is written by this guy named Napoleon Chagnon, and it has a preface, the deluxe illustrated edition with pictures that are great in it, has this introduction by this Harvard biologist, Edward O. Wilson, who's this famous guy, and he talks about how these are our ancestors. When we look at them, we're peering through deep time into the Pleistocene because they've lived in this timeless balance with nature, and that is how they survive, because if they had tried to develop or have, you know, industrialize or, you know, or develop agriculture, they would have ruined their environment. So they're in this sort of optimal balance from which they haven't budged for thousands of years. Now, before I go further, I should show, I realize this might be insulting, I should show you a map of the Amazon. My high school, in addition to showing me misleading pictures, never actually made me learn any geography. And so when I graduated, I had to learn all this in my 20s. But this is the Amazon. The basic way it works is that there's this huge mountain range here. The Andes, the second largest one in the world, and an absolutely tremendous volume of water flows off the mountains and goes into these streams. It's 1/5 of the world's above ground fresh water. And that this whole area, this light green basin, is essentially a giant mud flat. It's 70 feet, 100 feet deep of mud. There's no stone, no metal. There's nothing that you would normally think of that you could build a complex society with. And the next pictures I can show you are here, where a few years ago, an archaeologist and anthropologist tried to show me why they were changing their minds about how this all worked. This is, you know, our little trip through the forest. I'm not a botanist. To me, it looked like, you know, everything in my mother's window boxes had suddenly grown up to be 10 feet tall, or we'd shrunk. It was amazing. I was going through the pictures, and only afterwards did I realize it, because I was always last, you know, taking pictures. I didn't have any pictures of the front of anybody's face. So these are the, you know, the anthropologists, one guy from Tulane, one guy from Penn. You have to imagine the soundtrack in addition to the jungle sounds of, hey, come on, stop around. What they want to show me was this. This picture was taken about 200 yards, 200 meters away from the previous picture. And the reason they will point it out is about 1/5 of the forest is actually not forest, it's savanna, and it's been that way for a long time. And this part here in the, which is called in the western Amazon, where all the water is, you know, first whooshing down off the mountains, because it's so flat, it forms this enormous sheet of water that covers the earth for 4 or 5 months up to thigh deep. It's just like this big, slowly moving whoosh of water. And this is what it looks like, you know, when you can't walk around in it. It's really quite beautiful, although a pain to negotiate. And so what happened is when people moved in there, they didn't want to. This is the place where I showed you in the first pictures. And then remember that grassy side is right here. And you can see that this is, can you see this mound here? Yeah. There's another one here, and one up there, one up here. They built these artificial mounds because it's not much fun living in knee-deep water. And then because they wanted to be able to communicate from Mound A to Mound B, they built these earthen berms that take them across as highways. And traces of these are all over the place. You can see these here and here. Another thing that's quite useful is this here. The water drains away during the dry season, and so they dug these channels in there, and that allows you to, you know, portage with canoes and so forth, and it gives you, another couple of months of cheap transportation. Now, these ditches and so forth, and these are all over the place. This is actually tropical forest, an area that, from this top, from the air, it looks like there's nothing there. And then you see these channels that this archaeologist, this Keck, and his Bolivian colleague Sergio Correa were visiting last summer. And what you see when these illegal ranchers come and clear away is this kind of thing. And these things cover about 1,200 miles of the western Amazon from north to south. All these irregular ditches, nobody knows anything about them. The first English language publication of them was only a year ago. The first complete publication in Portuguese appeared about 6 months ago. And they're all over the western Amazon. It's a good thing that that guy who wrote Chariots of the Gods never heard about them, because otherwise he'd have another few bestsellers to do. And these things are all over as I said, this huge swath of the western Amazon, and they don't make sense. You can't see them unless they're cleared. And so what it implies is that the forest was, not this thick, unbroken thing that we saw, 500 years ago. It was not this sort of thick, unbroken canopy extending forever and ever, because there's about 400 of these known. Each of them is a few hundred meters in diameter. There's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff to the land. In addition, they had these things to grow stuff, and what these are raised fields. They're very much like the raised beds in your garden. Except they're much larger. Each one of these stripes is a couple hundred yards long. They're about 3 feet. They're about 3 feet high. And they do the same thing. They, better solar exposure, better drainage, pile up good soil on it, and they cover several thousand square miles. Now, the reason for showing you all these pictures of these strange things is to try to convince you that all this wasn't built by a couple guys in loincloths. Okay, that there is large populations of people here, and when you see this kind of thing, you have to say to yourself, typically, when you're building something like this involves some kind of engineer or architect or somebody, sort of supervising operations. You have to have people growing the food for the people who are making these things. There's a whole infrastructure, a social infrastructure implied by the existence of all of this. And it means that there are large populations in this part of the western Amazon at the time of Columbus that have since vanished, presumably by European diseases. I should say that if any of you are really sick of being teachers and want to have a midlife crisis and go into something completely different, very, very little work has been done here. You can get right in on the ground floor and make a different kind of contribution to society. Now, the way this has all been kept clear is by burning. To this day, the native peoples who are there in the Syriano now are, burn every year when it gets to be the dry season. It's really quite impressive. The first time I went down there, we camped out with the Syriano, and they were burning things. They had these big boxes of safety matches, and they're just, as they walk, leaving these trail of fire behind them. They invited my son to burn down a few acres, and I could see, I could see this journalist let son burn down rainforest. I could see how that would go. But the point is, when we were sleeping here, and there's these line of flame along the horizon, right? And I started saying, "Are you sure this is a good idea?" And they just laughed at my fears. They said, "We know what we're doing." And the fact is, they do know what they're doing. They've been maintaining this landscape in this way for a really, really long time. Now, I hope some of you are saying, "Well, wait a minute. If that's the case, if they had these big societies, how did they feed themselves, given the fact that the soils are so poor?" Remember, I was telling you about the soils being washed out, and part of the answer is shown here, I think. This is a papaya plantation about 1,200 miles up the Amazon, not too far from the city of Manaus, which is the largest city in the basin. What's important about this plantation is this here. This is the soil of the plantation, and you see it's dark black soil. It's the kind that you'd be very happy to have in your garden. And you see these things here. Remember I said there was no stone? Well, none of these are stone. These are all broken pieces of pre-Columbian pottery. It's about 900 years old. And here is an archaeological trench dug about 15 feet away from the previous picture. And you can see all this pottery and stuff has been buried in this very, very thick black soil. And what this soil is a completely artificial creation. They cleared the forest, and then instead of burning it, they turned it into charcoal, then smashed up the charcoal. And buried it into the soil. And there's an international team of archaeologists and soil scientists and botanists and geographers and like from Brazil, the United States, and Austria, and Japan who are trying to understand this. And the way it appears to work is that the charcoal that they buried into the soil acts like an artificial soil within the soil, and is a place for the nutrients and microorganisms that make soil, good. If any of you are gardeners, you're going to have these rich soils, and it acts for them as a place to hang out. Typical tropical soils are very acidic, full of aluminum, and are bad places for the kind of valuable microorganisms that make soil rich. And so they were essentially transforming large areas of the Amazon to make them suitable for agriculture. Then they wouldn't cut down the trees above the fields so much as, well, they would cut down the trees, but not to plant annual crops like we do, like wheat or rice or corn or whatever. But they would, what ecologists call, manage the succession. And they would cut down a bunch of useless trees and replace them with useful trees. And so what you're looking at when you look at the Amazon is an immense collection of ancient orchards. Archaeologists and botanists differ in how much of it is an artificial orchard that's gone feral. The sort of typical low estimate is about an eighth of the Amazon, which is about the size of France and Belgium combined, to larger groups of people who estimate that it's basically the size of Western Europe. All of this had been transformed. I should say, by the way, another sort of proof of all this, I grabbed some of the pottery last summer, and I put it on this banana leaf to make it look nice, and took a picture. And you can see it's worked pottery. It's not just sort of random sheets. This is what the archaeologists call wasteful behavior. In this particular field, which is half mile by half mile, the archaeologists estimate that they smashed maybe 10 million pots, and to get them 6 feet deep. Again, this is extraordinarily wasteful behavior. It implies large groups of people were able to do this. The Amazon was a busy, active place. Here is the most recent map that I was able to find of sites where this black earth, it's called terra preta, is found. I can say that the fact that none of it is found here is not so much a sign that there weren't people here as this is where people have looked. This shows you where people have looked. It's all over the place. Now, the point in telling you this is to argue that there were large populations here of people doing things. The point is not to give you the idea that we're dealing with these sort of ecological saints. I mean, Indians were human beings, and they screwed up just as much as anybody else. And so to counterpredict it, I thought I'd tell you a picture of a mistake, just to drive that point home. I mean, I think if your students ask you, the native people's record with the environment is pretty good, but they weren't superhuman. And here's Cahokia, which is that large place I mentioned. Here's another artist's reconstruction. It sprang up rather suddenly in about 1000 AD, just over a period of a couple decades. Estimates of its population go up to 100,000. I think people tend to think 20 to 30,000 is probably more likely, but again, in 1000 AD, that's a pretty large place. This was the first large-scale society north of the Rio Grande, built by native peoples, and they made some beginner's mistakes. And what appears to have happened is that that there was some sort of religious or charismatic figure and they threw up these mounds very quickly in sort of a celebration of this person's presence, and they created a kind of a Vatican or a symbolic capital that way, a Disneyland if you like, and the permanent population is almost more like a staff. And then lots and lots of people migrated back and forth to go to this wonderful place. Now, it's typical when this person died, the successors had to manage it. The successors, created bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy then creates trouble. To orient you here, here's what St. Louis is. This is the Mississippi, and Cahokia, as you can see, is just 10 miles away. If any of you are ever in St. Louis, it's really worth just driving to see. It's quite remarkable. And it's 1000 AD. They, like every human society, they need energy. In 1000 AD, that means wood. The best way to get the wood is to go all the way up to the top of the map, cut down trees, and drive them down Cahokia Creek, which then ran like this, and then they carry them down this far. Well, their version of the Army Corps of Engineers had a better idea, and they cut the new channel down here so they would float the trees right to their front yard. Now, because this was the first society north of River Grande that did things on a large scale, they made these beginner's mistakes. Two of these mistakes were, the first is that they didn't know that trees have this important secondary ecological function, which is retaining rainwater. And the second is that if you're in a place that you're going to make more flood prone, the last thing you want to do is cut a channel that brings that flood to your front door. And that's what they did, and in the archaeological record, there's all these, subtle signs of what happened. Suddenly there's, around 1250, there's these, foot-thick layers of mud with flattened houses underneath it. The government, their government, maintained its popular support by, because people believed that they would protect them from natural disasters and respond quickly if one came. When that didn't happen, the poll numbers declined rapidly, and the Cahokia government went through this flurry of cosmetic change to convince people that they were doing something. I think that you can see that in this way, Native peoples are just as human as the rest of us. As they went, and so they reconfigured the mounds, and they changed the way that the religious ceremonies were done. They gave everybody a special badge. And I'm not kidding about the badge. There's these wonderful, actually pendants is probably a better word, that were restricted to the elite. And suddenly after the floods, everybody gets one. But what happens when you do this is that there's always people who like the old way of doing things and people like the new way of doing things. Religion is involved. People aren't terribly rational about religion. And so there gets to be a civil war. And by 1400, the whole place is empty. It's just been completely destroyed by this combination of ecological problems and very poor response to them. If any of you are of European descent, I'm going to guess that some of you are. This may be interesting to you. This is one of the relatively few bad things I'm going to tell you happened to Native peoples that your ancestors had nothing to do with. This was entirely, on their own steam. Now, the point here again is not that they're bad or that they're good, but that the marks of the first inhabitants of the Americas are all over this country, and that they shape the landscape that we live in to this day. And that they're, it's not the dead past. It's around us in the most literal sense. Now, in some places, it's extremely obvious. This is Peru's version of South America's version of the Grand Canyon. I don't know if you can read that. It's Colca Valley in central Peru. It's really quite amazing. It's quite a bit like our Grand Canyon, high montane valley with this little river going down at the bottom. Except that in their Grand Canyon, I should say, this is actually deeper than our Grand Canyon. I mentioned this once. And a guy stood up in the audience and accused me of being unpatriotic because I didn't mention that their Grand Canyon is not as long as our Grand Canyon. So I'm steering away from this other than mention their inferior Grand Canyon. It is different from ours in a certain way that in about 600 AD, a society called Wari today terraced the whole darn thing in this extraordinary act of civil engineering. And from time to time, I run into civil engineers. And, I've got this picture on my computer, and I'll show them it, and I've done it 6, 7 times now, and say, do you think that our society could do this today? Build a place like this, because the water comes down here and splashes around and irrigates and ends up here. It's really quite amazing, and it still works. 1,400 years later, do you think that we could do this today? And I have yet to get this wholehearted positive response. You sort of go, well, maybe. I should say, as a journalist, I'm supposed to tell you the truth, and this picture is partly a lie. When I took it, I was just being a tourist, and there was this person standing here with a kind of a moo-moo on, a pink moo-moo, and I showed this picture to a friend who was a professional photographer. He said, you can't show them this because all they'll remember is the moo-moo. He took it off and with Photoshop, made this person go away in this kind of alarming way. So this part of the picture is a total lie, okay? But this is real. This part's real. It's really true. I mean, would you never know? It's just weird that he could do this. It took like 15 minutes. And this picture is completely unretouched, okay? This is another part of the valley. And you notice it's not as green or as pretty looking, and that's not because I retouched the other part to be green and pretty. It's just that there were many more people living in the Andes 500 years ago than there are now. This is all vacant real estate, and perfectly fertile, waiting for people to be there. But nobody's there because they're all wiped out by disease. In fact, it's one of the strange things is that the sort of center of wealth and power before Columbus was Mexico City down south, and it's been the world has been flipped over its axis, and the center of wealth and power is now up here, which was always the poorer place. And there's reasons for that, which that I could go into further, but I'm already taking too long. So you can ask a question if you're interested. these things are not just in South America. About 20 years ago, my uncle invited me to take a little cruise up the west side of Florida, the Gulf side of Florida. The cruise person, was talking all about how these wonderful natural mounds are on the shore, starting from Tampa all the way up to the Panhandle, to the corner of the Panhandle, and they're where the millionaires live, because they're a fantastic place to live. You're right on the water, but when there's a storm, you ride out the storm because the surge breaks around you. Well, it turns out that maybe they're not so natural after all, and in fact, the society called the Calusa essentially made them the entire west coast of Florida, with a little break sort of halfway up, sort of looked like this before. These are artificial mounds made out of a kind of cement you make by smashing together millions and millions of shells. They're quite densely populated. It was kind of like Los Angeles. You know how Los Angeles is this immense mass of villages sort of mushed together into a large conglomeration without any real urban structure? Well, this is the same thing, except it's been all spread along the coast. Now, it wasn't just a little scrim either. They built these large canals that stand for many miles inland, and these were, again, hydraulic management and also useful for transportation and fishing and so forth. So when you go along the west coast of Florida and you decry the artificial landscape with the strip malls and the golf courses and so forth, the problem with it is not that it's artificial. It's been artificial for a really, really long time. The problem is that the people who built it had no taste, if that's the way you feel. And that this has been, again, sculpted by the human presence for hundreds and hundreds of years. In the southwest, you have places like Taos, this is the last occupied pueblo. By now, I hope you're looking at this with your archaeologist's eyes and saying, aha, something like this, skilled craftspeople. Somebody had to feed the skilled craftspeople. That implies agriculture. We're in a desert. That implies irrigation. So that the mere fact that there's hundreds of these things around implies, again, relatively large-scale societies. There's a geographer named Doolittle at the University of Texas who's been trying to map, the areas that were irrigated. I've redrawn his map, which doesn't show up very well here. I should say the blue parts are not lakes. They're parts that were irrigated. They're a much larger area irrigated 500 years ago than now, probably sort of unsustainably. But again, large-scale human effort, covering huge areas, lots and lots of people, lots of engineers, major social and environmental impact. In the end of our book, I tried to do this map showing what the humanized landscapes were. A couple cartographers, including Doolittle, were horrified at my inept map making. And so we're actually working on a better map that I hope to put in later editions of the book. This is the most current one. I got it about a month ago, and the first thing I saw is they can't really see anything that's going on any better, even though it's more pretty looking. But you get I hope you get the general idea. Over here, there's probably, we don't have very much evidence for human impact. Also hasn't been looked for very much. If you want something in North America that's an actual wilderness, there's this very dry part right up there where there's not much going on. In the Northwest, there probably was a lot going on, but the evidence isn't really good yet. But pretty much everything was hit with these multiple impacts. And that what you're looking at is humanized landscapes that were controlled by people who ran the show. The people died, and the Europeans came in and had to deal with these landscapes that were rapidly going feral and did so more or less badly. And that's the story of the American environment. And so the things that Thoreau and Muir and those guys were celebrating as the sort of essential parts of of America, these great forests and so forth, were in most cases totally recent. They were brand new. And similarly, the Indians that they saw as a symbol of this eternal spirit, on their horses. The horses hadn't existed for more than a couple centuries. Before that, by and large, people in the West were agriculturalists, and what they had discovered when the horse came was the same thing that Europeans discovered when Genghis Khan came, that if you're a small peasant and a lot of people with horses come, you're helpless, and so they de-agriculturalized, and all this stuff that we see of this this Western culture, most of it is again a contemporary recent invention. And so that what we think of as the sort of past of America was something that was had rapidly sprung into existence after Columbus. And it really was a new world, but only in that sense. So that's really what I came to talk about. Thank you very much. Pragmatic image, what really might be a good way of putting that sort of first image in a high school textbook of what Native America was like. And this is a mural that's on the wall of this fantastic archaeology museum in Mexico City by the wonderful Mexican artist Miguel Covarrubia. And it shows Tenochtitlan, the capital of what's been called the Aztec Empire, as Cortez saw it. And there is, in the basin of Mexico, which is the sort of central part of Mexico, where Mexico City is now located, there's kind of a ring of mountains and high ridges. The bottom of this basin, there is a swampy area that over a few centuries, native peoples pulled drainage to create these large, sort of S-shaped series of artificial lakes, generally called Lake Texcoco, kind of 100 miles long from one end into other disciplines. It's to say that all three of these things are now thought by the great majority of researchers to be wrong. Most of them believe that Indians were here far longer than previously believed. Again, nobody really knows, but sort of typical guesstimate type numbers are 20 to 35,000 years ago. They were here in much greater numbers than previously believed. Typical sort of estimates are 40 to 60 million. I should note that those numbers keep rising, and as a personal guess, take it for what it's worth, I would think that the numbers, because they keep rising, might settle around 80 to 100 million when the dust all comes down. But that's just a guess. And they had far greater environmental impact than previously believed. And that's something that's of particular interest to me, and something I'm going to be talking about at greater length. So what I thought I would do to start off the talk proper is to show you my idea of what might be a better paradigm. First, as you probably know, there weren't any horses in the Americas before Columbus. There were some of these people who wore these kind of hats up here, but I don't think any of them were in, that must be the Rocky Mountains, right? I mean, I don't know what else it could be. And I have no idea, see this guy over here? Even he sort of wandered in from some sort of Wagnerian opera. I've occasionally shown this picture of this guy to archaeologists and anthropologists, and they'll scratch. I have no idea where he's from. These are tumbleweeds, I'm pretty sure, which didn't exist in the West. They're imports from Russia, even though they're symbols of the West, they're actually weren't around until the 19th century. And then had this huge population explosion when they were introduced. They covered the West. In fact, they were such a menace that a number of the Great Plains states attempted to enact legislation banning them. And there's going to be a big fence around Nebraska. This is actually one of the starting points for me. Not all that long ago, I went to my mother's house, and she demanded that after 30 years I clear out the attic where I put all my stuff. And I found my 10th grade U.S. history book. And this was the frontispiece. And this was the sort of paradigmatic image of the Americas before Columbus. And this is what I was taught in Interlake High School in 1969. And when I saw it, I was quite struck by it. Because I love this picture because it's quite unusual to see a picture in which absolutely everything is wrong. I mean, usually you get a few things kind of right by accident, but this one I think is pretty much 100% wrong. Kansas to sort of keep tumbleweeds out, and then there are so many of them they realize that they'd actually just knock over the fence. But anyway, so the point is that what I learned in my high school sort of went along with this. I basically learned three things about the first 15,000, 20,000 years of history in the Americas. And that is that the Indians walked across the Bering Straits about 12,000 years ago, which is not all that long ago as these things go. They lived for the most part in these small scattered bands, and they had so little impact on the environment that when Europeans showed up, the hemisphere was, for all intents and purposes, a wilderness. And one way to summarize the work of the last couple generations of anthropologists, archaeologists, geographers, ecologists, and people of many, many